Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Abigail Hirsch. I'm a clinical psychologist, founder at Lin Health, and incredibly excited this evening to be having a conversation with Dr. John Stracks, who I feel like I've met everybody else in your world, and we've never actually been on a call together. So it's really a treat for me to have this conversation and for us to really be getting to know each other, albeit in this slightly public forum. But with that, I thought maybe I would let you introduce yourself. And just one kind of note to folks in the audience, we love getting questions. The way we tend to run these webinars is to let questions stack up for about the first 2/3. So for about 40 minutes, we'll have a conversation. But do feel free to pop questions in if you're burning and got to get them in there. And then we will kind of go back through and look at all of the chats that have come in and answer some questions. And we have some that people sent in ahead of time as well for the back half, the back bit of the conversation. And okay, with that.
So thank you. It's delightful to be here and be meeting you. And I agree, like I know everybody in your world, but you and I haven't talked before. And so I'm Dr. John Stracks. I'm here in my office in Chicago. I have a medical practice in Chicago based and nationwide based on treating chronic pain from a more mind-body perspective. I've been in that world for a long time, since before even I went to medical school. I graduated from medical school in 2005 and then did a residency in general medicine with a concentration in integrative medicine and studied with Dr. John Sarno, who some of the listeners probably know, and Dr. Howard Schiebener, who has done some work with Lin Health as well, and then moved back to Chicago in 2009 when I finished my training to work at Northwestern Hospital in their integrative center, and then opened our own center in 2017. So I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to talk about the subject. It's my absolute favorite subject to talk about. I'm glad to be here with you.
Well, me too. And so I have to say, I am definitely the newbie in this world. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, something like that, put together some modules about pain for the previous company that I built, where at that point, the best I could find out there, and I'm so sad that I didn't meet this world earlier, but the best I could find was like, we don't know what to tell you to do, and maybe you should just do less. So that was horrible advice. But it's been the most wonderful, fascinating, truly every day of this journey, both intellectually for me as I learn about this world of what's really going on with chronic pain and with pain in general, and with the incredible thing that lives up here. But at the same time, it's also been an incredible, just, from a heart perspective, to see that there are better answers out there and that this is not having pain is not a life sentence or anything else. It's as my son, who is part of what got me on this journey, also who he likes to call now his superpower. So I really hope that this conversation is one more that people can learn a little bit about the world that we both are finding ourselves in. But I also really hope this evening that part of what we can do is imagine what we want the world to look like when we're having this conversation few more years down the road. But so that said, you alluded to that you got into the world of chronic pain even before you were a doctor. Would love to hear, just a little bit about that story, how you got in, what brought you into this.
So, a lot of us get in there with our own personal experience, right? And I've talked about this on camera before, but I was 28 years old, 1998. And I was sort of minding my own business, going through a significant life transition when I fell down a flight of stairs on the streets of Chicago, down by the river there. I know. I was kind of embarrassed. So I picked myself up and dusted myself off and went on my merry way. And it was fine for a couple of months. And then first thing I noticed is I was tripping a little bit in the hallways at work. and thought that was a little bit odd. And then the next thing I noticed, I was starting to get this shooting pain in my hands. And I, had always been healthy, never had any serious illness. And so I thought it was strange and thought maybe it would go away, but it started getting worse. And I went to see a physician, primary physician, thought, oh, maybe it's carpal tunnel. So I went to a hand surgeon, and the hand surgeon said, no, it's not carpal tunnel. I'm not sure what it is. And so they sent me to get an EMG, which is like this medieval torture device. And that didn't teach us anything. And so I moved outside the medical world and got acupuncture done and chiropractic done and saw a naturopath and changed my diet, and nothing was working. It was just getting worse and worse and worse. And it took me about 9 months to start to move out of that. And pain became like my whole world. It was all I could think about, it was all I could talk about, it was all I could focus on. The internet was sort of in its infancy in those days. And so I was searching about what this could be and how I could get better. And I started getting better at all places at a cocktail party, talking to a friend who had traveled to New York, who had seen Dr. John Sarno, who's did some of this work in the 20th century. And he's telling me about the experience. And I'm thinking, Dr. Sarno, I was in the process of transitioning careers. So I had been a social worker. I was thinking about going back to medical school, but I was really interested in the alternative medicine world. So I'd done all this reading, including some of Dr. Sarno's books. And I heard him talking. I was like, I know those theories. And I hadn't sort of associated with it because so much of it was about back pain. And this was in my hands and my feet and my arms and neck. And so I went home after the cocktail party and I reread the book. I was like, oh, I see. Just too much going on in my life and not enough emotional maturity to handle it. And so the next day I came home from work and I dusted off my bicycle and put air in the tires and got on it and started riding. And in Chicago, there's this beautiful bike path on the lakefront, and was living on the South Side. And so I rode into the city, and it was excruciatingly painful, right? It was awful. And I was moaning, and with every pedal, I kept telling myself, like, I'm not sick. I'm not sick. I'm not sick. I'm not sick. And after about half an hour, things started to calm down. I had flooded my system, and the pain really calmed down for the first time in months and months. And I got downtown and I turned around and came back into home and was probably 80% better at that point. And so I did some work, and I did some more psychological work, and over the next 3-4 months, I started to feel a lot better. And I kept a journal back then. And when I was done with the journaling after a 4-month, 5-month time period, there was no more journal entries, and that pain kind of went away and never really came back. And so that was my introduction to pain and disability. And then I went to medical school from there. And I can talk more about it. And
I bet you heard about this much about pain.
Yeah. No, there wasn't very much. And so I went to medical school. So I was in the process of applying to medical school, and decided that, this was my life's mission. I understood pain and how it worked. And I got to medical school and I thought, well, this is great. I'll just tell everybody who's here about what pain is and how it gets better. And that illusion lasted 3 days. And the first time I said to an attending physician that I thought I knew why somebody had pain because they were stressed, he just stared at me. Finally, he said, I don't get it. Did you order an MRI or did you not order an MRI? And so that was when I realized that it wasn't going to be as easy as just telling people about this. But again, this was my life's mission. And so I took every class that I could that had anything to do with pain and healing, and started calling Dr. No worries. And so I started calling Dr. Sarno in New York to see if I could come work in his office, and read books and talk to people about it, and kept just telling the story of what I knew about pain, and graduated from medical school and moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan to do residency. And that's when I met Dr. Howard Schubiner and started doing some work in his clinic. And as I grew in my knowledge, and as I grew in my certainty of how this worked, and as I grew in my authority as a physician, people started listening. And I remember the very first time that a patient got better based on what I told her about pain. And then um, and then it's, I've continued to try to learn everything that I can about how pain works and what pain is and how we can help make people better. One patient in particular that I remember who was diagnosed with fibromyalgia and got much, much, much better. She said to me as we were talking about this and learning about it, she said she always knew that she didn't have a physical problem, like through the whole, whatever it was, 10-year journey. She always knew in her gut that she wasn't broken in that way, but she didn't have the language. Nobody provided her the language for how to think about it and work on it differently. And so she just took medication and went to see doctors and tried to sort it out. And another patient who had migraines for 10 years, same thing. She said as she got better, she said she always knew that she wasn't going to be sick forever. But same thing, right? There just wasn't the language. There wasn't a way to understand it. And so when I think about pain and how we understand it, I frequently think when I was in Michigan, Dr. Schubiner and I went to the University of Michigan and proposed a study on patients with fibromyalgia. And the researchers looked at us and said, well, what do you want to do? And we said, well, we want to explain to people the nature of pain so that they understand it. And then we have this 4-week curriculum that has mindfulness and journal writing exercises. We want to take people through it. And so the researchers looked at each other and looked back at us and said, you can't do that. And we looked at each other, Dr. Schubert and I, and looked back and said, why not? And they said, well, that's two variables. You're doing two things. You're explaining the nature of pain, and then you're running them through a curriculum, and we won't know which one is effective. And so we looked at each other again and looked back and said, but if we don't do both, people won't get better. And I really do think that we need both. And so Dr. Schubiner has been a mindfulness meditation instructor for decades, but he got into this work because he was recognizing that meditation alone wasn't enough to make people's pain go away. And so we need this framework. We need this understanding of why meditation would be helpful before it can be helpful. And so that, I think, when I think about those two patients, they knew it, but they didn't have the language, they didn't have the structure, and they didn't have the framework. And so when we're able to provide that for them, then they saw the path clearly, how they could move forward.
Yeah, I really love that. This piece of tuning into those little voices, even if they're not the little voices that are the ones that feel like are everybody everywhere out there. But giving yourself permission to not just hear the voice that says, I need to search and search and search for what's wrong in my body, but maybe I could listen to the little bits of me that are like, this, maybe my body is really fine.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Two memories I have from it was 25 years ago now, but there was one where I had like signed up for a yoga class for people with disability, and so I was there, and there were 3 instructors per every student, and so I was doing a back bend, and there's one person supporting my head and 2 people at my waist, and I just had this distinct thought, like, I was a varsity college athlete. How did I find my way here? Like, it just didn't make any sense at all. And then I talked about the EMG, and I went to get that EMG done, and those things are so painful. And so they were working on my right side, and I was sweating and shaking and cold, and and they finished and they said, okay, everything's normal. I was like, oh, thank God. And I got up to walk out and they said, okay, now we're going to do the left side. And I said,
Oh my
no,
God.
no, you're not. And the fellow came up to me afterwards, like, oh, I think that's a good idea. So I got up and left, and I was better for 48 hours. Like, that was the first time in months that I had had any relief at all. And I think in retrospect, like, the frustration of it was so much that I got some of the emotion out and improved. But that stayed in my mind too. Like, how could an EMG make me better? And in retrospect, right, it's obvious, but in prospect, it was another one of those voices that said, like, something here doesn't quite make sense.
That's really interesting. So one of the things along kind of my journey that's been interesting as I've learned more is I thought I had a kid who had lots of somatic, lots of kind of primary stuff. What I've learned along this journey is that I also have had a ton of experiences that I just didn't even think about being this kind of pain. But when I look back, there's always this moment of like, that was weird. So I'll give one example. I had years of super itchy post C-section. I had 4 boys, all C-sections. After the first 3, my scar, I used to tell my husband, I feel like I need to scratch from the inside out, and I don't know how you do that. And then after the 4th one, it magically went away. So my 4th one was delivered by a medical student. But with a friend of mine who was a doula coming, and it was just this beautiful, very different experience. So I know today that the pain went away because I had this corrective experience and my body settled out. But I do remember thinking, like, that's so weird. Like, all the doctors couldn't sew me up well. And then this medical student who was probably the first person they've ever opened and shut, like, magically fixed me inside. Anyway, so believe that thought for everybody, to look for places where you have a little niggle of, gosh, that's weird. Gosh, that's unusual. Or I know that this is coming, not in my head, it's very real, but it's not because I'm broken.
Right.
So all right, I'm going to go off let's go a little bit of a different direction. I'm super curious if you think about, I think there's many medical villains we could name,
Sure.
But let's not do that. But I am curious to think about, in this world that you've come into, who's the medical hero, or who's your medical hero?
So, the 2 that I've named already, Dr. Sarno and Dr. Schubiner. And, a lot of people heard Rachel Zoffness talk with Ezra Klein yesterday about pain.
I think I've had it forwarded to me 100 times today.
No, I thought it was a good interview. I was really impressed. But, they talked about Dr. Sarno at the beginning and talked about what a polarizing figure he was. And in some ways he was. And I know people who hated him. But I just feel like he was brave enough to say what nobody was saying out loud in those days, and really both get the discussion started and figure out a way to get the message out. And there are still, thousands of people a year who will read his books, and it will make sense, and they'll see themselves in the pages, and will start them down the pathway of feeling better. And so it's really, I understand some of the criticisms, and I understand that, in some ways he was neither a great medical person or a great psychological person, but he spoke about the connection between the 2 of them before others were.
History is always unfair to the people who are the first folks to think out of the box. Even Aristotle and Descartes, and we could criticize them forever. But I do think, and I would say I wasn't lucky enough to get to ever interact with Dr. Sarno, but it does seem to me that he must have been an incredible observer, that he must have been able to look cleanly at what was in front of him, not with the bias of everything that he'd already been taught. And then to try and relate to what he was seeing.
Yeah. And he understood people and thought like a psychologist, and was able to combine what he knew about physiology and what he knew about human beings to help people understand how they could improve. And I think I will always owe him a debt of gratitude. That's how I got started on my journey, and both personally and ultimately professionally. Another Dr. David Schechter, is he on the Lin Health Advisory Board?
Another friend of, amazing, but talk a little bit about when you add him to the list, what are you thinking about?
So, this happened to me in 1998. And like I said, the internet was in its infancy, and there were Dr. Sarno's books, and that was about it. And he had just put out his Mind Body Workbook, and I must have found it on the internet and ordered it. And I wrote in that every day for 6 weeks or longer after I first learned about this. And he has since become a colleague and a friend. And I said to him fairly recently that when I was in the depths of this, right, the physicians who were affiliated with the hospital that I am affiliated with now and have been for 15 years, like nobody had any idea what to do with me, but he knew, right? And he was able to get that information out there so that I could access it and use what he had learned in order to help me get better. And so he really is on the front lines of this and has been doing this 25 years or more, and has gotten the word out and written his books and the workbook, and he's such a wonderful person as well. And so I think that combination of being brave enough to speak this truth and to put the information out there where people can access it, and being such a kind and gentle soul, it really, I just will always appreciate that in him. And then Dr. Schubiner, who, he opened up his mind-body medicine program in Detroit in between the time where I agreed to go to the University of Michigan for residency and then got to Ann Arbor in June of 2005. And so he wasn't there when I matched into that program, and then was when we moved. And I called him, and, nobody probably knows this about him, but the person who is the single top resident in the entire country in the internal medicine pediatrics combined residency wins the Howard Schubiner Award each year. So
wow.
There is a residency training award, a national award named after him. And so I was a first day intern, and I just called him and said, like, hey, I'm interested in this. He said, great, come on over, let's talk. And
the same reaction that he gives to everybody. I definitely been on my side of that call, and I was so struck. Here's somebody so great, and he always had the time to answer my, climbing the ramp questions.
Yeah, and so I spent time with him and went up and taught classes with him and took his classes and taught my own classes, and then he retired from the hospital a couple of months ago, and now he's working with me, and it's such a treat to know that, like, we have this history and all this mentoring that he has done, and now we're colleagues, and it's fantastic.
Amazing. So we were talking a little bit about research there. I love your story about looking. Hopefully I'm not freezing again. I am looking. I'm curious for when you think about the research that's happened over the course of your career, if you were going to pick a couple of studies or a couple of tidbits that we've really been able to show through research that for you are most mind-boggling or fascinating, or you could just read over and over and over, what would you put in that category?
There's so many, right? And the research continues to evolve. And so A couple of older ones that I quote all the time to people. So one is the various MRI studies that show that people have all kinds of disc and spine issues, regardless of whether they have pain or don't have pain. And so clearly, at least in my mind, show that it's not just the condition of the spine that determines how much pain we experience in our back. I also am a big fan of the Lithuanian whiplash studies. And,
Unbelievable. Can you explain what those studies are? I think many are amazing.
You know what whiplash is, and I know what whiplash is, and everybody who's listening know what whiplash is. But supposedly, people of Lithuania don't really have words or concepts for whiplash, and so some investigators from America thought that was odd. So they traveled over to the capital there, and they sat in the emergency room and they waited for people to come in after car accidents, and they interviewed them and found out how much pain they had, and then they called them the next day and the next week and the next month and a year later, and there was really no more or less neck pain after the car accident than there was before. And the investigators couldn't figure that out. They figured they must have missed something. And so they went back there a couple years later, and this time they interviewed people coming in with car accidents, and they also interviewed people who were coming in for other things, like they had cut their finger or they had a stomach ache, and talked about how much neck pain they used to have and how much they have now. And then they called them for the next month and the next year. It was the same thing. Like nobody had any more or less back pain, and the stomach ache people had the same amount of neck pain as the car crash people. And it really was. There was no concept of whiplash in Lithuania, and so people didn't get it. And they've done other studies where they've designed placebo car crash studies where you sit in a car simulator and you rock and you hear the sound of breaking glass. But the studies are designed so that there's no strain on people's necks. So there's no whiplash type injury. Right. And yet people end up with whiplash because of the fear and the worry and the
learning, right? That this is what's supposed to happen at the end of a car accident. I'm supposed to get whiplash.
Yeah. And then, a couple of years after that, and a lot of people don't know this, but the Canadian government had commissioned a study because they were paying out so much in disability to people who had whiplash injuries. And the title of the report from the commission that they gave to the central government in Quebec was "One Ticket to Lithuania, Please."
I love that. I love that. Interesting. So if you were going to summarize up for people, some of our folks listening to this may be a little newer to this world. If you were going to summarize, okay, what do we know today that, Sarno was maybe seeing or noticing, but we didn't have as much knowledge base, kind of top things that just are really clear when it comes to pain.
So pain comes from the brain, not from the body. And it doesn't matter so much what the situation is. And so, the example I use all the time that, say we get off this webinar and I hop down from my chair and I trip and I break my leg and I call you up and say, Abigail, what should I do? I don't want you to tell me to meditate for another half an hour. Like I want to go get medical care. And yet still in that situation, the pain is coming from my brain. It's not coming from my leg. And it's going to hurt because I know I need to get medical care. But in a different situation, right, if I'm, getting chased by somebody and I have to get out of there and I trip and I break my leg, I'm going to keep running. It's not going to hurt because there's more important things than tending to that leg at that point. And so pain is something that the brain decides given the information that's available to it. And sometimes that information is coming from within the body, and that can be important. And when I'm evaluating somebody, I don't want to miss it. If somebody's got a broken leg, I don't want to tell them to meditate when what they really need is an orthopedics referral. But there's a lot of other reasons that the brain can create pain too that don't have anything to do with what's going on in the body. It can do with what's going on in our lives and what our thoughts are and how we talk to ourselves and how we talk to other people and what feelings we have and how we handle our anger and our sadness and our grief. And so it's important to remember that the brain is intimately involved in all of this. If we don't pay attention to our brains and what's going on there, as we're trying to figure out how to heal this, we miss this enormous opportunity to make things better. And so I think that's the main point I want to get across. Some of the other points are that this is curable. And I don't, when people say, you can learn to live with your pain, or we can teach you strategies so that the pain isn't as bad, we can make pain go away. And we have patients who used to have pain all the time who don't anymore. And so these whole variety of strategies that we use to work on the brain and have it influence our body, we can get pain to go away. We don't have to settle with trying to learn to live with it. And so I think that's important to know. Go ahead.
That's one, and again, tell me if I'm breaking up. I'll get rid of my video again. But that's just thinking back to the conversation I had today with this young man. He actually said to me, I've been to a pain psychologist. Pain psychology is not going to help this. And I was like, what did you do with that pain psychologist? And what if you were going to write a thesis for your essay about my time with the pain psychologist, what would the thesis be? And he said, the thesis was, I have to cope with this. I have to live with this. So I can meditate to cope, or I can do less to cope. But I think it's so important that we've learned that what I often will call like the last generation and the next generation, the last generation strategies from psychologists were about dealing with a bad knock, or, you got unlucky. And the next generation are about pain recovery, about pain as a signal, pain as like I said, my son calls it a superpower. But they really are hopeful and proactive, and knowing that this is a normative thing that people get over all the time, or get through the discomfort of it.
Yeah. And I think, another point that I will make often is that healing from chronic pain looks different than the medical system would have you think. And so, we do a lot in the medical system to make people think that healing happens in a moment. And so if you have strep throat and I give you penicillin for your strep throat, you're going to feel better in 2 days, maybe 3 days, but you're gonna think you're dying because you're gonna have a fever and your throat is so sore and you have trouble swallowing, and then give you a medication, and 3 days later you're out playing golf. And the medical system really makes us think that like that's what it should look like. And the commercials we see on TV, right? Somebody's depressed and then they take a medication and they're not depressed anymore, or somebody has arthritis pain and they get an injection and then they don't. And so we think that healing is an instant, but my experience is that that's not how it works. Healing is like learning a skill. And so I frequently I'm always been an athlete, and kids are athletes. And so I think a lot in sports metaphors, and it's like learning to play tennis. Say you decide you want to be a really great tennis player, and you can work on it for 12 hours a day for 2 weeks, which is a lot of time. But after 2 weeks, you're not going to Wimbledon. You're not playing professional tennis. But if you keep working at it, you're going to get better. And sometimes, right, you'll work at it, and you have a certain backhand that you want to hit, and you practice it, and you go on the court and you hit it and it goes in the net, and you do it again and it goes in the net again. You keep hitting it and it keeps going in the net again. And then one day you're out playing and you hit it and it goes over the net. And it wasn't just because all of a sudden you learned how to do it. You'd worked on it. And then for a long time you didn't see the results, and then you did. And so healing from pain frequently, it gradually comes into focus. It's not here you're in pain and then you're not. You learn and you grow and you try some things, and it feels like you're running up into a wall, and then you have a breakthrough and you keep going, and there's some ups and downs to it. But it looks much more, I think, like that than here you are, you're sick, and then you're better. And so the medical system, I think, does a disservice in thinking that all illness is healed in an instant, when really, I think, most of the time it's a process.
Well, and maybe that's one that, as a psychologist, feels more natural. Although I really love that metaphor, because it is true very much about pain and other growth processes. That first, the rate at which people pick up new things varies vastly. I will never pick up a new sport as fast as my super athletic husband will.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that I can't enjoy picking up a new sport and, going along the journey. And so that is definitely true with pain. There are people, we know there are people who will read Sarna's book or who will listen to your incredible podcast that you did with Curable, and that we share with people all the time. And if anyone's listening and hasn't heard it, you should go check it out. It's really a wonderful listen. But there are people who will listen to 2 podcasts, and it starts to go. And your story has some of that, right? One time of repeating a mantra and it started to go. But there are other people that just that part of their brain learns by doing over and over and over, and it does it in its own sweet time. And that's fine. We have people at Lin, so we track, where our members are in terms of functioning and pain. We actually ask people to give us reports, but we don't show it to them because we don't want them to be focused on, is the ball going over the net? But we have people who it will be 9 months where there's little wins along the road. There's no question. And, they're enjoying the learning and the doing and the practicing much of it along the road. But then all of a sudden, 9 months out, the pain goes away. So to just know that there's not one timing that's right or wrong. This is kind of a process. All right, so I want to get back to one last thing before we open this up for questions. And just so everyone knows, in about 5 minutes, we will pull. I see there's a bunch of questions in the chat. I want to think about the future. So one of the things that was super exciting for me in starting Lin was to say, I don't want to wait 17 years for these ideas to get from where they are now into general practice. I want to find a way to bring them and use the strength of digital health and scaling companies to bring them in way quicker back to the core medical community. But so one of the things I've seen is the power of the EHR for doing that we now live in a world where we can actually force docs to ask questions if we want to, as a health system, because we pop it up and we won't close the window until they ask those questions. So if you could jerry-rig every EHR in all of America to ask 3 questions that you want every doc to have to ask, and what would they be? And why?
I like that question. So the first question that I want every physician to ask every patient is, hello, how are you? How's your day going?
I love that.
And it used to be a joke. It's not a joke anymore. I really want to get my yoga teacher colleagues to teach my yoga teacher friends to teach my physician colleagues how to interact with people. Because it doesn't take that much to say, hello, how are you? How's your day? And I hear stories all the time about physicians not only not saying that, but just saying so much worse to people. And there's just no reason to be impolite. There's no reason to be combative with patients, and just setting the stage and saying, hi, how are you? I'm glad you're here would be a huge victory for the medical system.
I love that. And honestly for pain too, right? Because we know that medical experiences that are yuck are going to, be triggering. All right, what's the next question that goes?
And so the other 2 are as you would expect. Anything stressful happening in your life? And, I made a vow, because I knew about this, right? And so I made a vow when I got to medical school, I would always ask that question to people who were in pain in my office. And I, asking that question as a medical student, right? One woman was suicidal, it turned out, and we got her the treatment that she needed. And another started telling me about the serious illness that her child had and how she was trying to cope. And we, one story I tell is that I sometimes get heart palpitations. And so when I was a new physician and dealing with, becoming running a practice, I called a colleague and said, I think I should get this checked out. And so I went to her office, and she's a friend, right? And spent 20 minutes there. I bet I said half a dozen times, I think it's stress related. And half a dozen times she said absolutely nothing. And so just being able to elicit that and talk about it. And, I was in a staff meeting at the hospital one time, and I was talking about this and said, I always ask back pain patients if there's anything stressful. And my colleague said, what about sinus infection patients? Do you ask them? And I was like, no, but maybe I will. And so somebody came in with a sinus infection that afternoon, and I said, anything stressful going on? She's like, oh, I just drove back from my brother's funeral. And I was, oh my God. And we got to talk about it a little bit. And then I was working urgent care a couple weeks later, and somebody had a sinus infection. I said, anything's going on that's stressful? And it turns out it was husband and wife were both there. I can't even remember who had the sinus infection, but the husband had just lost his job and they weren't sure what they were going to do. And so we talked about it for 2 minutes, maybe a minute and a half. And then I wrote a prescription, and we walked down the hall so they could check out. And they went on and on and on and on about how nice I was, right? I talked with them for 90 seconds, and they couldn't stop talking about what a wonderful, compassionate physician I was. And so it just doesn't take that much time and effort on our part as clinicians, but it takes more than zero effort.
Absolutely. All right, that's two. So we're hi, how are you? What's stressful, no matter what it is that people are coming in with? I really like that. Or is there anything stressful going on in your life?
And anything stressful that's happened in your life in the past. And that's a big can of worms, right? And so when I ask that, I sort of leave it at that. I just want to know, and what, am I looking at somebody who's got a history of trauma or not, or how much is there? And we can unpack that over time. I don't need the whole story at the very beginning when I don't know somebody and they don't know me, but over time, it helps me to know that there are episodes from the past that may be showing up in the present, and we need to address that.
Sure.
And we did a webinar last year for the Psychophysiological Disorders Association conference, and I interviewed Forrest, who runs the TMS Wiki that some of the listeners might know about.
And another resource, if you don't know about it, you should just Google TMS Wiki.
Yeah.
Oodles of great stuff.
Forrest, who started it, he had repetitive strain injury for decades, and he finally learned about this, and he got better, and he's been better for a long time. But I interviewed him about his history, and it turns out that his mother had died when he was 12, and the pain started when he was 15. And so, you and I don't need to be rocket scientists to understand what happened there. But I said to him, you were sick for 20 years. You saw, dozens and dozens and dozens of practitioners. How many ever asked you about your mother? And he said, of course, zero. Nobody ever asked about what had happened in the past, which sometimes that's the clue that we need. And so just, hello, how are you? I'm glad you're here. Anything stressful going on in your life right now, and anything stressful that's gone on in your life in the past?
I love that. I really, really love that. All right, I'm going to add my other one. I do also wish that everybody would ask every visit, is there anything happening that's uncomfortable in your body? And actually give me the whole list, as opposed to setting up that I can only hear about your migraine, or I can only hear about your shoulder pain or whatever, because you miss what's going on when you only hear a little, when people box the physician into only hearing about their part of the body. And I think that's how a lot of this gets missed. What piece of advice do you think is particularly important that people with chronic pain know?
And you and I talked a little bit about that earlier, but this is curable disease. This is not something that you have to live with for the rest of your life. And there's so many more things you can do for chronic pain than take a pill. And knowing that there are strategies, and knowing how to combine them, and knowing that it's probably not going to be any one thing that makes it all better, and knowing that this will gradually improve, and knowing that pain is not a response to damage in the body, but an assessment of the amount of danger, and learning what feels dangerous and how to create more safety in our lives, that all of that works together to really change the nature of how we interact with our bodies. And so again, this is not something that you learn to live with and learn to tolerate. And you were talking about the pain psychologist, and one of my patients told me that her pain psychologist told her she shouldn't come to the appointment with me because she had to stop believing that she could get better, and that it was a mistake to learn anything other than she could learn to tolerate it more. And I couldn't believe that. I felt so badly because that so flies in the face of everything we know about pain science.
It's how can I tell
Mhm.
if I've landed with somebody that's the right kind of help for me?
So, I think what you and I were talking about at the beginning, that, oftentimes we know what's important. We know what we need, and we know what's going to be helpful and what's not helpful. And so somebody asked me earlier today, like, how do you know when you need medical care as opposed to working on the level of our brain? And we talked about, learning over time and trusting that our bodies are healthy, and knowing that it's very, very rare for something catastrophic to happen that you have to recognize in an instant, or it's going to be too late. And she said to me, she's like, well, my mom put off care, and then it turned out it was too late and she died. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry about that. Tell me a little bit more. And she said, well, she went in for a mammogram, and she had cancer, and the radiologist told her that she didn't. And so, almost always when somebody tells me that story, that they delayed care and so they died, almost always it's the medical system that delayed care, not the patient. The patient knew that something was wrong, but couldn't get anybody to listen to them. And so I think that we all have really good intuition. And if we can slow down, we can listen to that small voice, we can oftentimes tell when we're in the right place and when we're not in the right place.
Amazing. Well, I always know that we've had a good conversation when it comes back around from beginning to end to a similar theme. So I think if we're back at a small voice, we should say this has been, for me, it's been a super interesting conversation. And I told you a little bit when we were chatting before, I was hoping that we could find some things to talk about that were a little bit different than the standard set of things that we talk about: mind, body, brain first, mind body disorders, brain first care, et cetera, all the time talk about. And I've really enjoyed getting to, play around with some different ideas and put this thing in a really different context. Mm-hmm. And I really, really look forward to the day that every EHR has the right first set of 3 questions, as opposed to what I used to have to answer, which were like asking behavioral health people, like, what's your temperature? I think that was number 1 question when they would come in for a psych visit. Like, really? But those 3 are so important for everybody. And maybe for people, one thing to take from this also, listen to those small voices. And, when you're getting care, you can answer those questions even if somebody hasn't asked them, because sometimes we can help open those doors too. So I will say we tried very hard at Lin, and I think we're pretty good at this, that the people come first. And so when people, in fact, we hear every single day when people call our intake or set up an intake conversation, always the feedback is like, wow, I did not expect that was going to be a real person who actually wanted to hear what was happening with me, and actually had the time to listen. So, do encourage everybody, if you're looking for a place to have that conversation, look, if you can go see Dr. Stracks or Dr. Schubiner, I'm going to push you in their door as fast as anybody else. You should be ecstatic and do that. But that said, also, and if you are kind of looking at Lin, I do hope that we can be a piece of having a conversation that's starting with the right questions, that understands this big picture of pain, that can help you start to listen to those little voices. And it's really from that first conversation forward, the way we've set this whole thing up is so that you have a coach with you who can continue helping you to, learn to do all of these things that can help, but to find your way and empower you to have your way down through, learning to play a great game of tennis, so to speak. So if people are interested, lin.health, you can always go there. There's a big, huge button that'll get you to an intake call. Just one purely promotional thing that, since we don't seem to have audio from the rest of my team, I'm just going to share. Anybody that does come in and schedule an intake call in the next couple of days, we're offering a first month for $89, something like that, which is like 4 coaching sessions and a diagnostic evaluation to help you listen to you. I think our medical providers, that's really mostly what they're doing in a lot of ways. But we want to make sure that there's a way to get in the door so that you're not delaying care, like Dr. Stracks was saying. So if you're a little bit itchy, call Dr. Stracks, call Dr. Schubiner, or call us, but definitely call. Like, don't wait and sit on this to see, is there help out there for something that is really, really treatable, curable, and move forwardable from.